Good morning.
Good morning.
I'm Gary Myers, and it's my pleasure to welcome all of you to today's symposium, sponsored by the University of Missouri School of Law and the Journal of Environmental and Sustainability Law. So I'm very excited to be here. I had dinner with the speakers last night and some of the editors of the journal, and I can tell you that you're in for a dynamic and engaging presentation by some very distinguished scholars and lawyers in the environmental field. I don't have many tasks here other than I want to introduce and also thank the organizer of this event, visiting Professor Melissa Berry.
Thank you, Dean Myers, and welcome everyone. We are so excited to have everyone here today. We have some big issues to tackle, and we have a variety of perspectives offering thoughts, some solutions, and what we're in for is talking about, as you've gathered from the title, what the next generation of environmental law will look like. We face some of our, if not the most, the biggest challenges that we've ever seen before, particularly with the urgency of climate change and other social aspects and economic things that are happening in our country and the world right now. This is a time where we are looking at how we're addressing our environmental and natural resources challenges. Are we still governed for the most part by statutes that were enacted in the 1970s? They have evolved, and our keynote speaker, Tony Arnold, will be elaborating on some generational analysis of where we are with environmental law, what those generations have looked like, but for the most part, we're still working under the same operating scheme for the last 40 years. What we're looking at today, and what has been brought to our attention in large part through resilience science and resilience theory being brought in, and particularly scholars like Professor Arnold and some of our other speakers today are bringing this into the law and saying, how can we use this science of resilience, and if you don't know what that is, you'll be hearing a lot about it today, into addressing our environmental challenges and our environmental structure, how we address these issues currently, and what we think the next iteration of environmental law will look like. And so that's our goal for today, our objective. And in a way, we have to ask, are we ready? And the other question is, do we have a choice? This is a bit of a choose-your-own-ending adventure, and we are faced with a variety of paths that we can choose, like those books when you're a kid and you can pick which choice to make and skip to the page at the end that tells you what happens to you if that's your ending. Well, that's what we're doing, and that's part of what we're here to talk about today. So with great pleasure, I welcome you all, and what will be our plan for today will be to have the foundation laid for us about what resilience science is, what the generations of environmental law have been to date, and what a lot of the terminology means, resilience, adaptation, adaptive management, adaptive government. That foundation being laid by our keynote speaker, whom I'll introduce in a moment, Tony Arnold. And then we have Melinda Harn-Benson, who is a professor at the University of New Mexico, who will also be laying some of our foundation about resilience and asking questions about, is resilience the new narrative for environmental law and natural resources, and indeed even beyond those particular categories. One of the things that we'll be addressing today is that environmental and natural resource issues are not limited to the statutes and the institutions that address environmental law. We have land use issues, we have housing issues, we have transportation issues. So resilience and adaptation spread into all of those areas. So they are really laying the foundation for the rest of the day. And then basically we're starting from a global approach. We have Professor Andy Long, who has come to us from the University of Missouri, Kansas City Law School, and he is going to be talking about, from an international law perspective, looking at these challenges and how that sheds some light on the future of this next generation of environmental law. And then we have Professor Elizabeth Kronk-Warner from the University of Kansas School of Law, and she'll be looking through the lens of indigenous peoples and climate change. So each speaker has a particular perspective that they will be bringing. Then we have a break for lunch, and then when we come back, you'll be seeing me again, and I will be giving a perspective and talking about environmental justice issues and the past, present, and future of environmental justice. Then we have Professor Donald Cochin from Chapman University, the Dale E. Fowler School of Law at Chapman University. He's going to be providing our law and economics perspective. And then, as you can see, we're kind of moving from global to domestic issues, and we, our concluding speaker, basically the bookend of the day, is Sarah Parker Pauley, who is the Director of Natural Resources for Missouri, and she is going to be talking about adaptive management in Missouri and some things that are happening, and addressing some of the question is, now that we've heard all this theory throughout the day, we're going to hear from a regulator who is actually on the ground and can tell us if our theory is matching up with what's actually happening. Is it very practical or not? Is this realistic? And so we really look forward to hearing your thoughts on that and hearing from everyone today. So, and after each speaker, we'll have an opportunity for you to ask questions or comments, and we invite you all to participate. We want to have a really interactive day. So please take that opportunity. We'd love to hear from everyone. All right, well, it is my great pleasure to introduce, I'm not even sure what to call him. He has so many titles, they didn't even really fit on our program. So, Associate Dean, Professor of Law, Bold Chair in Property and Land Use at the University of Louisville, Louis Brandeis School of Law. He is also teaches and an affiliate professor in the Department of Urban and Public Affairs, and he also directs the, I have to use my notes for this part because again, we could be here quite a long time, so I'm not going to go through his entire history. You can read that as I see some of you reading it, but he is really internationally known for his scholarship and his interdisciplinary work. So one of the things that he is doing at the University of Louisville is he is the director of the Center for Land Use and Environmental Responsibility, and he is also a faculty affiliate with the Ostrom Workshop in Political Theory and Policy Analysis at Indiana University in Bloomington. And he has been a distinguished visitor at a number of law schools in the country, and we're just really excited to have him here today. He is why we're here today. His ideas had so much influence on what is happening in environmental law and land use today. And he is someone who I met, a little over 10 years ago now, and had the pleasure of working with for a few years, and someone who really took me as a new little fledgling professor under his wing and mentored me, and we worked together at Chapman University working on their interdisciplinary program with environmental law, land use, and real estate. And so it was then where I really started to see a lot of the connections of interdisciplinary work, and that's something that he created and spearheaded, and it's wonderful to see him having expanded and taking around the country his ideas and sharing with us. So we are delighted to have him here today. Like I said, we'd be here for quite a while more, and he only has an hour if I elaborate too much. But you do have your cowboy boots on today. So one thing he is known for is getting down in, getting his boots muddy and getting involved in the community. So thank you for being here today.
Thanks. So thank you, Melissa. That's a very nice introduction. I appreciate that. And I think that my dean thinks that if there's just like more titles, that then I'll just do more work for the same pay. So I think that's really more what it's about. And but I so appreciate it, and thank you, Gary, for the warm welcome, and the editors of the Law Review or Law Journal, and just everybody for such wonderful hospitality. This is an exciting program and so forth. So, all right. So I'm starting somewhat unconventionally, not so long ago, in a nation close by. Okay, that's supposed to say environmental law. Okay, somehow in the when it uploaded. All right, so that's supposed to look like Star Wars, but it's supposed to say environmental law. Episode 4, A New Hope. It is a period of uncertainty and change. Climate change is threatening communities and ecosystems. The old regimes are fragmented, divided, only partially effective. They falter in the face of drought, flood, invasive species, polluted runoff, and land development pressures. The landscapes of forests, farms, and cities are changing, even shifting. Restoration of ecosystems fail. Injustices persist. Systems become rigid and inflexible. Meanwhile, a new force for adaptation and social-ecological resilience slowly emerges and evolves. Can it help communities and ecosystems be more resilient? Is this new generation of environmental law our hope for a better future? That's my talk today, Environmental Law Episode 4, A New Hope. Can environmental law adapt for resilient communities and ecosystems? So I'm going to start with what I see as basically 4 generations of environmental law that we are now slowly emerging into a 4th generation of environmental law. And occasionally when I bring this up, I mention this, people say, well, I didn't realize we ever left the first one, but you see that it all sort of fits together. So generations. So our first generation of environmental law, for the most part, most people sort of think about this, occurred sort of contemporaneously or around the Earth Day, 1970, and the sort of time frame shortly before and shortly after that, where we saw the development of a lot of environmental statutes, federal environmental statutes, were largely command and control statutes. That basically mandated certain behaviors, prohibited certain behaviors, prohibited behaviors unless you got a permit under the following sorts of standards and conditions and so forth. And then the sort of whole administrative and regulatory regime that developed after that. A lot of these were based on technology-based standards, basically forcing or requiring those who are contributing to pollution or degradation of the environment to improve their technology to reduce the impact on the environment. And we also saw that this was really about a rule of law litigation. This is a term that Dan Tarlock developed a number of years ago to refer to this idea that we use citizen suits and other kinds of litigation to enforce these environmental statutes and really ensure that environmental protection is basically a legal mechanism. Now this regime, this sort of first generation of environmental law, is largely about things like clean air, clean water, protection of endangered species, consideration of environmental impacts, and a lot of it has to do with front-end prescriptions that we're going to mandate up front that you either protect the environment, maintain it in a certain condition, a certain condition of environmental quality, or that we're going to mandate that the degraded environment be restored. Okay, and so for example, the Clean Water Act, the basic purpose stated in the Clean Water Act, which actually has legal significance. Many purpose statements do not, but in the Clean Water Act, this is really sort of taken off, and the statement is to maintain and restore the physical, chemical, and biological integrity of the nation's waters. And so the idea was that there is a set of sort of pre-disturbance conditions of preferred environmental conditions that we're going to preserve or require that we have some sort of restoration to. Over time, the rigid nature of the command and control mechanisms raise some questions about whether they're really very effective, and probably more powerfully, are they economically efficient? And are there ways in which some sort of flexibility could be built in that would allow the regulated community to engage in environmental performance that was arguably equivalent, but perhaps more cost effectively. And so we saw a variety of different kinds of regulatory flexibility mechanisms that arise. This is really sort of a more market-oriented kind of perspective. And second generation also involved or has involved a lot of harnessing of market incentives. So the use of tax incentives and tax credits, use of subsidies, and that sort of thing. And then eventually, kind of along came the third generation. You kind of see the presidents that sort of went with these, right? So Nixon was the president really when a lot of the environmental statutes were enacted, and the Reagan administration is associated with a lot of the sort of second generation policies and developments. Bill Clinton and Al Gore their administrations was largely about sort of reinventing government and sort of taking a somewhat broader view that looked more at outcomes. Okay, so looking at outcomes-based instrument choice, more collaborative, decentralized, voluntary processes trying to stimulate innovations. And it's largely about stimulating innovation. Reflexive law and public-private partnerships. So things like, like various kinds of environmental standards, forestry standards, or environmental performance standards that industry might have developed or has developed, and so forth. And government, private sector partnerships. And then we also saw the really growth of attention to sustainability and the concept of sustainable development, and that has become a buzzword. We talk about it a lot. We're not always sure what we mean by it, right? And so that's an issue. But the idea here is that we are wanting to sustain our environment, economy, and society. That's usually the sort of three-legged stool with sustainability. And so the idea is that we need some sort of integration of environmental policies and laws, economic policies and markets, and social and equitable considerations. And all of that has continued to exist. But what we're seeing now is the emergence of this fourth generation. And this fourth generation is focused on adaptation and adaptive governance. It's focused on social-ecological resilience, which I'm going to explain what that's about in just a bit. And more in terms of integration, basically things like ecosystem governance, watershed governance, for example, governance on the scale of ecosystems, and the use of networks and transdisciplinary problem solving, but also something that I refer to as multimodality, which is, one of those sort of multi-syllabic words that you pick up in an academic setting, and you're like, hey, I got my tuition dollars worth, or I got my registration dollars worth, and I gotta go home and tell my family that we talked about multimodality today. But that's basically use of multiple modes, multiple methods, multiple instruments. So it's a toolbox approach. Okay, there's no panacea, there's no one-size-fits-all, there's no cookie-cutter kind of solutions. And so that part of the whole idea about fourth generation is that our problems are way more complex and challenging and even daunting than we ever realized. And I'm going to talk a little bit about why that is the case, but that's what we're seeing develop. And by the way, I don't really know that I have President Obama's picture up there because he's currently the president. I'm not entirely sure that I would say that there is a tremendous amount of fourth generation environmental law necessarily coming centrally out of the White House. I mean, I don't, maybe a little bit, but I don't see that. I think it's actually a more pervasive kind of evolutionary, emergent kind of phenomenon throughout the nation as a whole. So I want to be clear about that. Okay, so one of the things I want to point out here is that these four generations are cumulative. Okay, this is not a situation where the new generation emerges and like the Greek gods or whoever they were that would kill off the parent and then be the sole living generation, right? This is kind of an all in the family approach, and so these are cumulative, and so we still have first generation environmental laws, we still have second generation incentives and flex reg kinds of tools out there. We still have sustainable development and sort of decentralized and public-private partnership sorts of tools, and now we have this emergent and innovative governance for systemic resilience. In this, by the way, the evolution that we see in environmental law also somewhat tracks evolution in land use law and policy and water law and policy. And I just want to point that out. I'm not going to spend time on that slide too much, but I just want to say that in all of these fields we see more and more movement towards flexibility and multiple tools to deal with complexity. So this evolution is the result of multiple forces in society. So there's the pace and magnitude of ecological change that is just simply forcing us to deal with environmental problems differently. The traditional modes of environmental law and regulation just aren't working very well anymore. Those produce complex and multidimensional problems in society. Okay, so a whole variety of different kinds of things, from drought to flood to the shift of, for example, of crops and vegetation, and we're seeing more and more move of softwood, sort of pine type of forest, into what have historically been hardwood forest and that kind of thing. And all sorts of problems that then end up creating real challenges in society. And then the pace and magnitude of social change as well in this very complex society. And that puts lots of pressures on environmental law, which then change. Now this is what it sometimes feels like. Okay, this is what it feels like, right? There's ecosystem evolution, legal and institutional evolution, socio-political, and it looks like it's all wandering around all over everywhere. And so, I think anybody who sort of stops and thinks about this, that also says, wow, it just seems kind of messy and whatnot. But I'm hoping to try to create some sense of order out of what's going on, to sort of see how this works. So one of the things that, as Melissa pointed out, that's important for what we're talking about here is the concept of resilience. And resilience has become a really significant concept in environmental science, but it is also a really important concept in everything from social work and to community organizing and development, to economics and financial markets. I mean, the whole sort of potential collapse of the EU financial system when so Greece and Spain and so forth were having so much problem with the debt and fiscal policies and so forth. There was a lot of discussion about resilience and resilience theory and how it applies. Dealing with hazards, potential hazards, whether it's tornado or flood or other earthquake or that kind of thing, and so forth. So resilience is important. And by the way, I would like to include the picture here of Mono Lake, one of my favorite topics to talk about, because Mono Lake is a story about decline and then a bounce back. And so it's I think, an interesting story about resilience. So what is resilience? Resilience is the capacity of a system to adapt to disturbances while retaining its core functions and structure. There are actually several different definitions of resilience that are out there that are relatively close to one another, that have some subtle nuances. This is the one I'm going to use. I think for our purposes, the subtle nuances don't really make that much difference. They're a little bit more oriented towards, I think, some scientific distinctions. So the idea here is that systems always are experiencing different disturbances and stressors of different sort. And the question is, how adaptive is that system to be able to absorb those disturbances and those stressors without changing its basic structure and function. And so what we've learned is that from resilience science is that especially ecological systems can exist in multiple stable states. Okay, and I put this cool slide up here because this is the basic resilience cycle. Okay, quit looking at the slide. Stop looking at the slide and look at me for a moment. Okay, so we are not going to go through all the details of the resilience cycle. And we'll talk about K phases and omega phases and so forth. No, we're not going to do that. All right. So instead, what I want you to sort of see is the overall visual of the idea that systems can become more rigid and inflexible over time, and then there's some point where a threshold disturbance causes collapse or causes a shift, what sometimes we call flipping that system into a different state or a different regime. Okay, so something, so it shifts. So the idea here is that the systems can exist in multiple stable states, and that as they become more and more rigid and brittle, that the effect of disturbances can actually become great, and there can be a sudden, unexpected shift. Okay, now that is not the only kind of dynamic that happens with systems. Okay, systems also can develop and enhance their adaptive capacity, and they can adapt in sort of very incremental evolutionary ways that end up maintaining the structure of the system. Okay, so that's quite possible. And the system that the regime that a system flips to might be better, might be worse. Okay, so sometimes it's catastrophic from a more sort of normative standpoint, in terms of we don't like the fact that now, for example, this lake has eutrophication, that it's basically a dead zone because nutrients have led to these algae blooms, which now, okay, so what used to be a healthy, thriving lake is now a relatively dead lake with algae blooms, right? Okay, that's the kind of flip that we're talking about. Sometimes, okay, that's bad, right? So I think we probably can agree that that's bad. But not all, not all regime shifts are necessarily bad. So that's the idea. So the example is prairie or grassland transitions. Okay, so the idea, and by the way, this is a prairie restoration project a number of years ago near the Old Chisholm Trail in Wichita, Kansas, or near Wichita, Kansas, and this is just last summer at the same location and so forth. But what had happened there previously is that the grasslands, the tall grass prairie there, had been totally devastated due to a variety of different kinds of disturbances. It had become woody, basically it had become shrubland, and really pretty poor quality, poor functioning shrubland. And so there's this restoration process underway. Why had that happened? Well, there are disturbances that actually increase the resilience of grasslands. Things like fire, oftentimes in the prairies, lightning storm-induced fires, or what we call wildfires, drought, and things like bison wallowing in the ground. Okay, or bison grazing. Okay, those kinds of things help to maintain the prairie grassland as opposed to becoming sort of woody and deteriorating into a different system. And so the idea is that in that case, sometimes disturbance can be beneficial, and the lack of disturbance actually leads to a brittle, inflexible system that then becomes something else, like the shrubland. So that's an example. Social-ecological resilience is about the idea that the resilience of social systems and the resilience of ecological systems or ecosystems are interconnected in complex, dynamic, nonlinear relationships. Okay, so complex, meaning that there are all kinds of relationships that are not easy to follow, that are and that may be remote in their relationship. Dynamic, meaning changing over time, and nonlinear, meaning that there's not clear cause and effect. It's not like, okay, you do this and then this happens. That a lot of times the effects of different kinds of actions or disturbances or that kind of thing can be remote in time or in space or that kind of thing. So, for example, the idea, and we'll get to this slide in just a moment, but the idea that application of fertilizers to lands in, say, I'm just going to pick on my own state of Kentucky, application of fertilizer to land in Kentucky, whether it's the suburban home or the farm or whatever, I'm not going to pick on anybody in particular, but any of that ends up ultimately at some point in the Gulf of Mexico creating a hypoxic dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico, right? And so there's these sort of these nonlinear relationships. The resilience of human communities and social institutions depend on the resilience of natural communities and ecosystems and vice versa. So we're not just focused, when we talk about social ecological resilience, we're not just focused on the natural environment. We're looking at the relationship between the natural environment and the social system, and that those are important to think about interconnectedly. So here's an example of how you can have these different sort of resilience cycles having effects across one another. And here's another one. So for example, changes in climate patterns, large-scale stuff, can have effects on the functions and structures of river basins, medium-scale effects, which then, in effect, have, over time, different kinds of effects on smaller sub-watershed functions, the more local watershed, okay? And that's kind of part of the idea. But there are all sorts of other things that can happen. So, for example, the adoption of inflexible command and control regimes, okay, that impose these very strict, inflexible requirements on landowners, developers, businesses, that kind of thing, can end up producing political pushback that end up undermining and causing, in some cases, collapse or at least threat to the basic environmental regulatory regime, because there hasn't been a thought about how the effort to protect the environment has effects on the economy, the local political culture, and that kind of thing. And so we see that happen. Endangered Species Act is an example where there's periodically pushback that then ends up undermining how that system works because we haven't really thought through how it's going to play out. And so some examples of the relationships between social resilience and ecological resilience. One is Hurricane Katrina. It's one of the more famous examples. This is the school bus that got washed up against the levee wall there and so forth. So what did we see? We saw the use of sort of more rigid, inflexible engineering mechanisms to do a couple things. First of all, build levees that were really good at dealing with or mitigating against minor flooding, but proved totally inadequate for a major level 5 hurricane, category 5 hurricane. Also, the loss of coastal wetlands in South Louisiana. So that had to do with land development, it had to do with oil and gas development, it had to do with all that sediment coming down the Mississippi from places like, for example, Kentucky. I'm not picking on Missouri, but you get the idea, right? Okay, had to do with some social things like building low-income neighborhoods in low-lying areas, right? It had to do with some social political kinds of things like not having a very good emergency preparedness plan, or at least if you had one, you weren't implementing it as intended, right? So there are a whole variety of things where we see that the degradation and disturbance to the ecosystem and the degradation and disturbance to the social system were interconnected. And I mentioned earlier the Gulf hypoxia zone where we have nutrients running down the greater Mississippi River Basin, which stretches all the way from Pennsylvania on one end to Montana on the other end, and up across the northern part of the United States and all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. Okay, so it sounds like what we really like to see is more resilience, right? We want systems to be more resilient to these disturbances and changes. Well, okay, and that's generally what I'm going to say, but I'm going to say that resilience is not always a good thing. All right, and so any opportunity you have in a PowerPoint slide to put Hitler and Mussolini in the PowerPoint, right? Okay, now the point is that some system, resilience is not normative just on its own, right? At least from a scientific perspective. Some systems we don't want to be all that resilient. So brutal regimes that harm human rights. This is the sweat factory up there. This is the sort of industrial pollution. Anybody know what this is? Kudzu, yes. Okay, an ecosystem of kudzu is pretty resilient, but it's not one that we want to be resilient, right? I mean, it's an invasive species, right? So everybody sort of gets the point that it's not necessarily the case that we want all systems to be resilient. But when we're thinking about healthy functioning ecosystems, and we're thinking about healthy functioning communities, human communities, social ecological resilience is a good thing. And so that's important as we sort of think about that. Well, how does that happen? How do we help to have more resilient social ecological systems? Well, key piece of this is adaptation and adaptive capacity, the extent to which we have built into our institutions adaptive capacity. Why do we need adaptive environmental law for social ecological resilience? Well, one has to do with the complexity that I mentioned. We have interconnected systems with these nonlinear dynamics, and they are very complex. So think about the relationships between land use, land development patterns, water quality, water supply, right, and climate. Okay, the four of those just in and of themselves are interconnected in very complex ways. I can't even go into them right now, all of the ways that those are interrelated. But obviously land development affects water supply, but also creates demand for water supply, creates runoff that causes water quality problems. But let me just kind of give a brief example of a problem that could arise. Let's say for a moment that we want more sustainable land development patterns, and what we're doing is we're encouraging or facilitating or even mandating all of this mixed use, compact, high density, transit-oriented development in the urban core. Okay? Sounds like a good idea according to the smart growth advocates, right? It's sustainable development and so forth. Okay? And arguably it's going to discourage or prevent sprawl if we do that. Okay? So that there's some good effects in terms of water quality, water runoff, development of farmland, other kind of development of environmentally sensitive lands if we discourage sprawl and so forth. But there are communities that are unfortunately in their single-minded push towards this kind of smart growth development policy, putting more and more people in what are likely to become growing floodplains as climate changes, as flood patterns change, and so on and so forth, without the sort of necessary how do you deal with emergencies, how do you evacuate people, how do you deal with runoff problems, I mean all sorts of things like that. So there aren't simple answers, there just aren't easy answers. In addition, the pace and scope of disturbances and changes really tell us that we need to become more adaptive and quickly. Uncertainty is a big reason for adaptive capacity. We just simply don't know a lot about what the future is going to be. Okay, so there's this phrase that has come to be used, which is stationarity is dead. What does that mean? Well, stationarity is this idea that the environmental and natural resources conditions fluctuate within this sort of relatively narrow range of historic conditions. So stream flows in a waterway have historically, we have peaks, we have valleys, we know they change, but here's the historic conditions in these rivers and streams and so forth. And so we can make predictions and we can know, well, in a drought year, we're only going to have this much water flow. We could have floods of this much in this year and so on and so forth, right? And so that's the idea. But what's turning out to be the case is the conditions are changing beyond historic conditions. And we've got all kinds of dynamics, whether they have to do with population and land development and human dynamics, whether they have to do with climate change or changing patterns of climate. In places where the term climate change is not politically popular, but people are talking about sustained drought or drought that exceeds historic conditions. It's not that those communities aren't talking about, they're just staying away from the politically charged term, but they're talking about it, right? When we talk about flood issues in the East, right? And the fact that the patterns aren't necessarily matching. Okay, I thought it was a really good idea a couple of months ago when I was going to fly here to fly through Atlanta rather than Chicago, right? Okay, right? You would think that would be a really good prediction, right? So wrong. And so I was on the phone I was on hold for 45 minutes on Wednesday trying to get my flight through Atlanta changed to a flight through Chicago. So, all right, so that leads us to our last point here, which is limits to human capacity. Okay, we just know from cognitive science that human beings make enormous mistakes. We have all kinds of judgment heuristics or biases that in our psyche that just shape, and we can make enormous mistakes. We can totally misjudge risk. But even when we're using more quantitative analytical tools, again, those models turn out to be, inadequate in many cases, okay? And so we're constantly trying to find new models. I mean, we don't give up. We don't just say, well, we have limited capacity, so we'll just remain dumb, right? That's not what we're doing. But we have to acknowledge that we have real constraints on our cognitive capacity, but also our organizational and institutional capacity. I mean, bureaucratic behavior still is bureaucratic behavior. I mean, in how many ever centuries of bureaucracies, we really haven't been able to overcome some of those pathologies of how bureaucracies work. I mean, that's just part and parcel. I mean, there's some advantages, there's some good things. I mean, it's not like we just throw the baby out with the bathwater, but it's important to understand that we have these constraints. So, law is often a barrier to social ecological resilience because the legal theory is really very much at odds with what we know about resilience theory. Legal theory means basically what we're trying to do with the legal system is achieve certainty. Right? We have stare decisis, and we reliance on precedent. We establish rights, and we want them to be secure, and that supports economic investment and economic opportunity, and so forth. It supports liberty. It supports political arrangements, or the distribution of power, and that sort of thing in society. So there are all sorts of reasons why law is it doesn't mesh with resilient science. We also like to establish things up front. There are a lot of planning requirements. Decision making is made up front. Law is also fragmented, especially environmental law, and I'm going to talk about that later. But we have all different kinds of ways of classifying and regulating or legislating or that sort of thing that fall into different categories. Law can be rigid. There can be, as I mentioned before, a demand for certainty in law. And there is also a tendency for these unimodal sort of approaches. We like to pick our favorite instrument, our one-size-fits-all, our model, our panacea, the silver bullet, the things that's going to fix it for us. And by the way, not these law professors, but there is a tendency of law professors to do this, to sort of say, well, the answer to all of our problems is right here in my law review article, if you would just adopt it, right, and so forth, right? I mean, that's part, and to some degree, we have incentives as academics to do that. But also, I mean, the same is true for all sorts of lawyers, of regulators, of businesses. Everybody wants to have sort of the answer, the solution, and we can be way overconfident in that. So here's an example of how the environmental protection of water is fragmented. Okay, there are totally or mostly separate legal regimes for the management of surface water rights, for groundwater rights, for point source pollution controls, for urban non-point source controls, which actually are kind of a mix in many ways of point and non-point because of the MS4, the Municipal Separate Storm Sewer System permitting requirements, rural and agricultural non-point source controls, wetlands regulations, protections, endangered species and their aquatic habitats, land use planning and regulation, local, often disconnected from these, legal principles and doctrines related to navigation and recreation, such as the Federal Navigation Servitude. Water development projects are oftentimes handled totally separately from these. Flood management, and then the really difficult one is energy law and policy. And I'm going to mostly stay away from energy because it is so, I mean, it's such a complex and game changer kind of problem about how energy relates to all of these different fields. It scares me, so I'm going to, in the time we have, I'm going to stay away from that. But I just want you to see, I mean, lots of different legal regimes, and they don't coordinate very well with one another. I mentioned water and climate uncertainty, so we're seeing more and more evidence of extreme drought, of extreme flood, things that don't match historic patterns. It's important to be careful about looking at any one phenomenon as an evidence of a pattern, right? So it's important just, to not point to one event and so forth. But when we start looking at the patterns, again, the idea is that historic trends are not very good predictors anymore. Environmental protections of water are maladaptive in a lot of their either-or classifications. It's either surface water or groundwater. It's either the water transfers among water bodies. Okay, the Supreme Court dealt with this issue, the Miccosukee tribe case, and then the EPA came along and developed a rule about it. But it's either a transfer that requires an NPDES permit, basically a point source discharge that requires a permit under the Clean Water Act, or it's not. There's no in-between ground here. There's no some do and some don't. It's all one or the other. Waters and wetlands, they're either subject to federal jurisdiction under the Clean Water Act, or they're not. Right? There's no other sort of alternative. The waters are subject to the public trust or not. We tend to like to adopt regulations or use incentives and market tools or engage in some sort of collaborative problem solving, but there is a resistance to sort of integrating all these together. And this happens in other areas. Endangered Species Act. Either the species is protected as a listed endangered or threatened species, or it's not. It has no protection, right? The species is either recovered or it's not. So those kinds of problems. And then the upfront predictions and prescriptions are also maladaptive. We set these water quality standards for bodies of water up front, and there they remain, regardless of how the aquatic conditions change, other ecosystem conditions change, society changes, our needs or demands change, and likewise TMDLs, total maximum daily loads. Okay, there's just a recent study by the General Accounting Office that shows that many TMDLs, which is the maximum daily load of a pollutant that a waterway is allowed to have, which are developed by the states. Okay, these states have adopted these TMDLs, and litigation has largely pushed them to be forced to do so. And so we see that happening and so forth. But many of these TMDLs do not have any mechanisms for ongoing monitoring and change to the TMDL if conditions change. Okay, some do. So it's not impermissible, but it doesn't happen as much as we like. Permit conditions and terms. You go and you get your NPDES permit from the state agency or the EPA that allows you a certain amount of point source pollution, and those are your terms, and you just keep complying with that, even if, again, conditions change, and maybe more or less would be okay. I mean, depending or should happen, right? The conditions might change. Municipal separate storm sewer system permits, 404 permits. Okay, how we analyze the environmental impacts of, say, for example, flood projects under NEPA. Okay, is also we make these upfront predictions, and we could be totally wrong, terribly wrong. And resilient science says that there is some reasonable risk that we are going to be terribly wrong, and yet there's no back-end mechanisms for adjusting what we're doing. Design of restoration projects. Again, we pick a restoration project, and a lot of times what we're doing with restoration projects is we're wanting to return something to a pre-disturbance state that's simply not going to be possible because the system has flipped into a totally different system. You can't just put it back. It doesn't, the science doesn't work that way. And so it doesn't mean that we can't make it a healthy functioning ecosystem, but it's largely going to be a somewhat different system. So those are some examples. Water rights and takings is another area where there have been a number of takings cases which, in my view, end up really sort of creating this false security about just sort of trying to lock in the rights holders' entitlements against change. And generally, my view is that the property law is by its nature, is one that changes and evolves over time. We don't lock in, for example, the water or the property doctrines that we had in, England in, the time of William the Conqueror, for example, right? Property law changes over time, but there has been this tendency to, in the water area, to go to court to get just compensation to prevent legal change from occurring. So what are our options here? We actually have 5 different things that could be used to increase our adaptive capacity. One is adaptation, second is adaptive management, a third is adaptive planning, fourth is adaptive governance, and fifth is adaptive law. So adaptation is about changing behaviors in response to changed or changing conditions or disturbances. So, coastal communities have to adapt to changing coastal dynamics. That's kind of the nature of it. Adaptive management is a dominant concept in the natural resources and increasingly in the environmental field, which is the idea that natural resources or ecosystems need to be managed in a flexible, continuous set of experiments or learning processes because of conditions of uncertainty and incomplete knowledge. And so rather than just pick a direction and say, okay, we're just now going to implement this plan in a sort of lockstep format, and whatever happens, we're just going to keep implementing the plan. Instead, you're engaging in more incremental experimentation. Well, now let's do this with the wetland. Let's try this. And you sort of see what happens. And you have feedback loops. You monitor, you assess the impacts of what you've done, you learn from it, and you make adjustments. You adapt your direction, your actions, management actions. Adaptive management is a very popular term. It's used a lot as a term, but it doesn't happen very much. Okay, actually, most agencies sort of make references to adaptive management, but not very many of them actually have built in the necessary feedback loops. There's also a tension between adaptive management as a process to follow for managing resources and legal requirements that you have upfront planning. And adaptive management has historically had kind of this anti-planning outlook. And I think that's unfortunate because there is a method of planning that is adaptive planning. And this is an iterative, evolving process of identifying goals and making decisions for future actions that are flexible, that contemplate uncertainty in multiple possible scenarios, The planning process includes feedback loops for frequent modification to plans and their implementation, and they build planning and management capacity to adapt to change. And so one of the things we're seeing is that there are a number of communities around the US and Canada, both, as we sort of see this in both countries, that are engaged in watershed planning or water supply planning for climate change using adaptive planning processes. This is starting to take hold more. And so we might sort of think about how those two end up being related. Then there's a concept a number of scholars have talked about, adaptive governance, which is more about overall governance institutions that are facilitating adaptation and where the structures of governance are more flexible, more modular, more polycentric, and that kind of thing. And so the idea is that you still are talking about what your social and ecological goals are. You're not just kind of drifting along, well, let's try this, we have no idea what we want. Okay, that's not what we're talking about. But setting goals and then picking policies that will achieve those goals, you might build in more adaptation into the policies. And so multiple centers of power nested across various appropriate scales and functions. Redundancy is an adaptive approach. We always like efficiency. I'm sure the dean understands pressures from the university to be as efficient as possible, with do as much with as few resources. But if there is a major catastrophe, okay, right? Think about anything that is really lean, and there's a major catastrophe, right? There's no give there, right? Redundancy is actually an adaptive process. For example, at the University of Louisville, we're talking about cross-training. Okay, so honestly, okay, I'm just going to step aside from this for just a second, but honestly, if our director of student records won the lottery and went to the Bahamas, we'd be in serious trouble, right? Okay, so that's an example. There's an enormous vulnerability there because we have an efficiency that is not resilient. So there's sometimes some tension between efficiency and resilience. Spatial and social connectivity through networks and so forth. And then there's an adaptive law. So Lance Gunderson, who's a resilience scientist, and I developed this idea that the law could be more adaptive. And so this is about, first of all, multiple forms of resilience, both social systems and ecosystems. So the structure is multi-everything, multimodal, multi-scalar, multiple scales, polycentric, many centers of power, but it also is, there's loose integration, that there is an attempt to build bridges across, say, for example, land use, water quality, water supply, that sort of thing. The methods are context regarding, there is a tolerance for uncertainty, flexible discretionary decision making is embraced rather than saying discretion is bad. Discretion is actually good. It gives you some flexibility, and there's a moderate or evolutionary adaptation. There are no big changes. So, for example, in the property rights area, I don't think these sort of radical changes where we go from, okay, there's property rights, now we'll just eliminate them. That is not an adaptive approach. And then iterative processes with feedback loops and accountability built in, but also the influence of social and ecological forces. So adaptive environmental law, as I mentioned before, is emerging. And one example has to do with watershed governance institutions, where we see an increasing number of what we call watershed governance, watershed planning, watershed management, watershed restoration, actual entities organized around watersheds, so the Tahoe, the Lake Tahoe Regional Planning Authority, for example, or the state of Washington and the state of Oregon both have watershed planning acts that require, that are sort of state mandated and so forth. But what we see here is that these are multi-participant, that they are often evolutionary, that people are actually coming up with creative solutions to different kinds of problems over time. So, so for example, the Blackfoot Challenge in Montana started working on one issue, then they moved to a different issue, and then a third issue, and they became more adaptive, more resilient as they went. A lot of times these are mixed, top-down, bottom-up. They are not purely collaborative, they are partially collaborative, but they also involve litigation and regulation and legislation and market tools and the whole sort of range. They are truly multimodal and multi-process. I think another example where we see sort of this adaptation for social ecological resilience is what we call the urban ecosystem services. Ecosystem services are the socially and economically valuable services that ecosystems or that nature provides to society. We oftentimes find that there might not be markets for them, but there are certainly value. And one of the areas where we're seeing this in urban areas is the use of green infrastructure as a preferred method to more typically gray infrastructure, engineered stuff. So instead of conduits and pipes and drainage ditches and that kind of stuff, instead we're seeing the use and development of rain gardens, wetlands, rain barrels, bioswales, and so forth. So this is from Kansas City, Missouri, rain garden over here, the example. Again, what we see here is that that green infrastructure is more resilient, and there are what we call co-benefits. They're actually providing all kinds of urban heat island mitigation. They're helping to sequester carbon. They're greening neighborhoods. They're making people happier. They're connecting kids with nature. All those kinds of things. Local food security is another area where we see this more social-ecological resilience and adaptive capacity approach. So the idea here is to enhance the resilience of local communities by increasing decreasing their reliance on global food networks and instead increasing the local food supply, locally grown foods. And there's a big local food movement in a lot of cities. There's a huge one in Louisville and so forth. But it's not, it's an interesting mix. It's partly about demand. It's partly about, farmers markets and restaurants with locally grown foods and that kind of stuff. It's partly about urban agriculture and zoning for urban agriculture. But honestly, almost no city can support itself on urban land. It's just not going to happen. It's also about relationships, regional connections, regional networks for farmland preservation and farmland conservation and use of tools like conservation easements. Okay, so some of it might involve some regulatory stuff, might involve some growth control, but in a lot of communities that's not really what's happening. Instead what it is about creating sort of the economic markets that actually make it economically viable to preserve farmland as opposed to develop them into shopping malls or subdivisions or that kind of thing. And supply networks and so on and so forth. Sustainable farming practices is another one. Okay. So let me go back. So there is some potential for disappointment and some reasons for hope. And so I've used the Lake Tahoe where we've had some great progress with Lake Tahoe, but also at times some setbacks. So what are some concerns here? Okay. And I'm going to be trying to kind of wrap this up with these last few points here. All right, so it's possible that this fourth generation environmental law is just additive, it's just the passing phase, okay? On the other hand, the very nature of fourth generation environmental law is it is evolutionary and emergent. It's not a top-down, gee, Congress got together one day and decided we're now going to adopt fourth generation environmental law. And so because it's adaptive, it may actually be with us much longer in change over time as we need it to. Another reason for potential disappointment is this could be standardless. This could be the let's all get together, hold hands, sing kumbaya, and feel more resilient. Right? And, right? And I mean, that's the concern. I mean, are there any standards? Resilient science, though, is more scientific than, for example, sustainability, which is pretty vague. And there are standards that can be based in precaution, based on identification of thresholds where you flip to a different system, in integrating social resilience and ecological resilience, looking for those interconnections where community vitality and ecological vitality are threatened or strengthened, alternatively. So it's not a vague, all-inclusive kind of thing. Another sort of reason for disappointment is this just can be discouraging and overwhelming. Complexity is complex, it makes our minds hurt, and we'd rather just go home and watch another season of Breaking Bad, right? Okay, right? Or something, whatever, right? Okay, but the thing is, complexity is real. We need to deal with it. Right? I mean, and we need tools to deal with it, and fourth generation environmental law is a move to help our environmental law system be more adaptive to that complexity. And finally, that there is quite possible, as we see with adaptive management, for example, that there really are no real formal feedback loops that are ever adopted, that we aren't monitoring, assessing, learning, and adapting, but instead, again, we sort of say, hey, well, we're going to try to be more adaptive. We're going to have all these sort of watershed planning networks going on, and isn't that great, and so forth, but we're never actually making ourselves know are we good learning. However, I think that what we're seeing some informal and emergent feedback loops, and it's in part because the whole governance process itself is turning out to be more iterative. Okay, and sometimes, again, that involves things like litigation. Litigation can be a disturbance that inhibits problem solving and that inhibits collaboration, but sometimes litigation can be a disturbance that actually breaks a logjam and gets the parties back to collaborating and interacting. And we see that again. I think watershed governance is a good example. And as the process evolves over time, as I mentioned, for example, Blackfoot Challenge, right? There they learn from one set of activities, and then they move to the next, and they implemented those lessons. And so we actually are seeing improved conditions in the Blackfoot River. We're seeing improved conditions in Lake Tahoe. We're seeing improved conditions in the Clark Fork in Montana, in the Green River in Kentucky. So that is happening. So I'm going to suggest that we take a hopeful approach. That hope itself is an adaptive and resilient approach. It is certainly better than the alternative. And by the way, I think like all or almost all the speakers, I'm a Gen Xer. Okay, so I'm not inclined, I mean, I'm supposed to be pessimistic and cynical, right? Just by generational nature and so forth. But I actually think that there is reason for hope, and that by taking a more hopeful approach, that is resilient. All right, so this is supposed to say, may the fourth be with you. All right, thank you. So
we do have a few minutes for questions.
Okay, I'll take some questions. Yes?
Do you see an expansion of executive powers to help increase the adaptive capacity of government to deal with a more changing environment?
I'm not sure that I do. I mean, it's possible that that might become a moment or a mechanism for an attempt to do so, but I actually think that, again, this sort of more polycentric nature of adaptation and adaptive governance and so forth means it's much more likely that it's going to occur at sort of multiple levels. I mean, I think one of the questions at a federal level is Congress broke, right? I mean, is Congress one of these maladaptive systems that is going to flip to a different? I mean, it's actually arguably is a different kind of state or regime right now than it used to be, right? Right? I mean, so when you think about the days of Bob Dole and Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan and Bill Clinton, right? I mean, they had conflict, but they could all get something done, right? And so there's a possibility that we're going to see more and more bypassing Congress. But I don't know that means that it's going to be all about concentration of power in the White House. Okay. Another thing that you might be behind your question is, are we going to see more authority exercised by governors? That might be another thing, and maybe because at least that also has sort of a polycentric approach, and at least we've got 50 of them and so forth.
Yes, I had a question based off the topic of the socio-political issue when you were talking about clause coastal lands, especially in North Carolina. They've had a problem with the big coal ash, along with Tennessee and in Charleston, West Virginia, the big chemical spill. And my question is, we understand that these places typically are most affected by pollution. Typically, they have problems with their low socioeconomic status. How do we influence their government, or like state government, federal government, EPA, those different organizations to possibly put more influence in monitoring and help spread awareness of environmental impacts and what we can do to protect the citizens?
Right. Okay, so again, it was one of those really complex, challenging issues, and so there aren't easy answers there. I think one of the things, so let me pick on the part where you said that tend to be lower income and minority communities and so forth. And so one of the things that I think Professor Berry's going to talk about is that we have seen that grassroots organizations in at least some of those communities around the U.S. have tended to pick up techniques of adaptation and focus on community resilience as opposed to these kind of sort of one project oppositional kinds of approaches. And sometimes, if you're facing the dragon, you got to pull out the sword and try to slay the dragon, right? I mean, that makes some. I mean, I'm not saying that the oppositional stuff is necessarily wrong or bad, but for the long-term capacity of that institution or that community to be resilient, I mean, it's going to have to go beyond that. And so we see more and more tools like that. So I think that there's this whole sort of urban parks, green infrastructure movement in Los Angeles that has ended up being very effective across a whole bunch of different kinds of issues. Another one is the Little Village Environmental Justice Organization in Chicago. I have my favorite examples and so forth. I think that Kentucky has some real similarities, say, to West Virginia, especially in the eastern part of the state, where you have such dependence of small rural and small town kinds of communities on the coal industry that really does harm the resilience of those communities and their empowerment and so forth. Because and it's complex because that their concern is that if they're pushing back against an industry on which their economy and livelihood depends, is that a maladaptive approach too? And so, it's tough. Yeah. And so I mean, it suggests that again, this is not a replacement. There are needs there's a need for the first generation, and the second and the third generations of environmental law. Those don't go away. Yes.
How important is understanding science for the legal profession to make this shift towards a more adaptive approach?
I think that I think it is important, and I think that that the legal profession is, there's much more sort of interdisciplinary approaches to environmental lawyering now than in the past. I mean, I think people have either learned or had to learn more about the science and so forth. Of course, it's not like the lawyers are going to be doing the science necessarily themselves, but I think that the idea is that the legal profession is having to become increasingly interdisciplinary. And it's not just environmental law. I mean, that is true also in sort of the financial market side of law as well, securities and so forth, understanding how those systems work and so forth. I think one of the things that is a challenge is the ways in which scientists and lawyers communicate with one another. They're different languages, and they really are like the Star Wars things, right? Whatever that was, right? I mean, I was a Klingon or something, right? So, but that is a challenge. Is what what are the scientists saying? What are they meaning? What are the lawyers saying? And what are they meaning? Mindy Harm-Benson and I are part of an adaptive water governance team that is looking at, is working with where we've got scientists and legal scholars and people in a number of other disciplines as well. And one of the things we found on our very first session was we went through an exercise where we sort of broke down some of the different uses of terminology and some of the underlying fundamental assumptions. And so, scientists have to learn more about law too. One of the things that, that just because something is or is predicted to be scientifically doesn't mean that then it's going to redefine law.
One of the things it seems like you're going to run into as you take this approach is you have to develop conflict management structures that are going to be able to address this. And I wonder what that does to transaction costs. I mean, for example, bringing in you to run a session on adaptive management, there's a cost involved in that.
That's right.
And for you to do it effectively, you have to stay involved. I mean, how does that how do you see that being addressed in all of this?
First of all, I think that we're finding, again, you're looking at it more sort of empirically, how it works on the ground kind of thing, that we're seeing that there are multiple approaches. So again, there's not a single approach to dealing with this. So sometimes it doesn't require somebody who has expertise in conflict management. Sometimes people have those tools that come more on the ground. So I mean, there's some great examples out west of some ranchers who just, they were good. They just had this skill set to bring together conflicting interests and so forth in a way that a law professor never could do. Right? I mean, it just wouldn't happen, right? And so there's some examples like that. So multiple ways of doing it, but also you're trading off those transaction costs against, say, for example, litigation costs, or the cost of collapse or failure or whatnot when there's just simply not enough water in the basin, or when the water quality is so impaired that you have to now build a new water treatment facility and so forth. So that's part of it. I mean, the transaction costs occur at a particular point in time. Sometimes the other costs that you're offsetting them against occur later, and so that ends up being an issue. I mean, where do you come up with the money up front to kind of make that investment in conflict management and conflict resolution when you really weren't going to see the cost of the conflict till down the road? So I mean, they're tough issues. I mean, this is a good question.
Sort of related to that, you didn't talk about mediation.
Mm-hmm.
Is that
Mm-hmm.
something that's part of the solution?
Mediation can help. I think a lot of what's happening in some of these areas is creation of whole sort of informal or quasi-formal, governance. I mean, there might be ongoing collaborations or networks or whatnot, and so sometimes the presence of a third party facilitator can help, but sometimes it can also distract because they're not they're not a stakeholder like the others and so forth. So it's going to be context specific, I guess is what I would say to that. But it definitely can play a role, and it depends on the situation. Okay, super.
All right. Thank you so much.